A 50-foot tall steel holding tank located on Commercial Street in Boston's North End was the source of disaster that has been named the Great Molasses Flood. The tank, holding over 2 million gallons of the sugary sweet content, was property of United States Industrial Alcohol. Taking in regular shipments of molasses from the Caribbean, it was used to produce ethanol, a key component in munitions manufacturing, as well as an active ingredient in alcohol. They built the tank in 1915 after World War I increased the demand for these products. However, the construction of the tank was rushed and haphazard. The hurried nature of construction saw the tank leaking on its very first day it held molasses. Being patched only when necessary, this came to a head in 1919. This is the story of the Great Molasses Flood. As mentioned earlier, the tank was built in 1915 by the USIA and was sitting harborside on the site of the Purity Distilling Company near Kenny Square in Boston, Massachusetts. Standing 50 feet tall and being 90 feet wide, over the years due to wear and tear, the container started to groan and peel. Often leaking molasses onto the street, at least one employee of the USIA warned his boss of the coming danger. But outside of recaulking the cracks that formed, the company took little action. By January of 1919, the largely Italian and Irish families living on Commercial Street had grown accustomed to hearing rumbles and the metallic creaks coming from the tank, and on the early afternoon of Wednesday the 15th, disaster took place. On the previous day, a ship had delivered a fresh load of molasses, which was transferred into the tank without issue. This load being the factory's last since Prohibition was to begin in 1916, USIA bought enough molasses to fill the tank to the brim in order to get the most out of the last year of production. In the previous 4 years, they had only filled it to that level 8 other times. Temperatures on the 15th were just over 40 degrees, which was unusually mild for Boston winter. Commercial Street hummed with the sound of laborers, trotting horses, and the nearby train that sped right through town. The day for many Bostonians was going as any other. At the Engine 31 firehouse, just down the street from the tank, a group of men ate lunch as they played a card game. Near the tank, 8-year-old Antonio D'Estasio and his sister Maria gathered wood for their family, and at his home, which overlooked the tank, bartender Martin Clougherty was still sleeping in his bed, having put in a late-night shift at his saloon. Just as the clock hit 12:40 p.m., the calm was broken by the sound of a metallic roar. Before residents had time to register what was happening, the recently filled molasses tank ripped wide open, unleashing 2.3 million gallons of dark sludge. A manhole covered near the base of the tank had burst open after a fatigue crack grew to the point of criticality. Weighing about 13,000 tons, a 15-foot wall of syrup cascaded over Commercial Street and was estimated to reach 35 miles per hour. The density of molasses being 40% more than water results in it having a great deal of potential energy. The collapse translated this energy into a wave moving in every direction, obliterating all the people, horses, buildings, and electrical poles in its path. Even the solid steel supports of the elevated train platform were snapped. Horses were trapped in molasses and were unable to move. The more they struggled, the deeper in the mess they became. Antonio and Maria D'Estasio were instantly swallowed by the wave. Maria was suffocated to death by the molasses. Antonio, who suffered a severe head injury from being flung into a light post, did survive. The force of the molasses wave caused buildings to cringe up as though they were made of pasteboard, one survivor recalled. The Engine 31 firehouse was not clean off its foundation, causing its second story to collapse into its first. The nearby Clougherty house was swept away and crashed against the elevated train platform. Bartender Martin Clougherty, having just woken up, watched his home crumble around him before being thrown into the current. "I was in bed on the 3rd floor of my house when I heard a deep rumble," he remembered. "When I woke up and looked out the window, there was several feet of molasses outside." Bartender used a makeshift boat made out of his bed to rescue his sister Teresa, but his mother and younger brother were among those killed in the disaster. As quickly as it had crashed, the molasses wave receded, revealing a half-mile swath of crushed buildings, crumpled bodies, and waist-deep muck. Several city blocks surrounding the tank were under 2 to 3 feet of molasses. Police and firefighters arrived at the scene within minutes, as did over 100 sailors from the Navy ship USS Nantucket. The first responders struggled to wade through the quicksand-like molasses, which had begun to harden in the winter chill, but they soon began plucking survivors from the wreckage. The most dramatic rescue took place at the Engine 31 firehouse, where several of the men from the lunchtime card game were trapped in a molasses-flooded pocket of space on the collapsed first floor. Workers freed the survivors after hours of cutting away floorboards and debris, but not before one of the firefighters lost his strength and drowned. Over the next several days, rescue workers continued to sift through the ruins, rescuing those stuck and recovering the bodies of those lost. The human toll would eventually climb to 21 dead and 150 injured, but many of the deceased remained missing for several days. The remains of one victim, a wagon driver named Cesar Nicolo, were not fished out of the nearby Boston Harbor until almost 4 months after the flood. In the wake of the disaster, the victims filed 119 different lawsuits against the United States Industrial Alcohol. The plaintiffs argued that the molasses tank had been too thin and shoddily built to safely hold its contents. The USIA offered a very different explanation for the rupture: sabotage. The flood had occurred during a period of increased terrorist activity from Italian anarchist groups, which had previously been blamed for dozens of bombings across the country. In 1918, when World War I was still underway, an unidentified man had even called the USIA's office and threatened to destroy this very tank with dynamite. With this in mind, the company alleged the tank had been intentionally blown up. The lawsuits against the USIA were eventually combined into a mammoth legal proceeding that dragged on for 5 years. Over 1,000 witnesses testified, including explosive experts, flood survivors, and USIA employees. The closing arguments alone took 11 weeks. But in April of 1925, State Auditor Hugh Ogden finally ruled that the USIA was to blame for the disaster. Rather than a bomb, he concluded that the company's poor planning and lack of oversight had led to the tank's structural failure. The USIA would later pay the flood victims and their family members $628,000 in damages, the equivalent of around $8 million today. By the time the settlement was finally paid out, the area around Commercial Street had long recovered from the multi-million-gallon molasses tsunami. Over 300 workers had converged on the scene in the days after the disaster to remove the wreckage and debris, and firefighters later used brooms, saws, and saltwater pumps to strip away the last of the syrupy residue. Even then, the sweet scent of molasses still hung over the north end for several weeks, and the waters of the Boston Harbor remained stained brown until the summer.